It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler. It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler.
Hey guys, Tyler here. There is something that is known as Project 2025. Now, as everybody knows, Donald Trump by far is the most popular candidate for the Republican Party. And as soon as he gets into office, he will enact something like Project 2025 as soon as possible. And so the question then becomes, what exactly the policies inside the documentation? Now, there's over like 900 pages, and for this video, I am not going to go over 900 pages for you guys to actually know about the details, just some segments or highlights about the documentation that I found the most interesting. The next conservative president must make the institution of America's civil society hard targets for woke cultural warriors. They start with deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensibility, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive America of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. I'm not necessarily in favor of censorship of words, largely because politicians, for better or worse, have their own First Amendment protections as well. And so any kind of words, any kind of vocabulary that a lawmaker want to make, I don't think we should actually censor the words based upon something we don't necessarily like. In order for us to actually understand, what law is actually good or bad, we must debate the law based upon the merit and not the words that we actually use. And so I'm not necessarily in favor of wanting to delete words just because we don't necessarily like words. Pornography should be outlawed. The people who produce and distribute it should be imprisoned. When it comes to an artistic expression, pornography is covered by the First Amendment because it manifests itself through books, it manifests itself through art, it manifests itself through video games, and also movies. And the last time I checked, movies, drawings, video games, all the kind of artistic mediums are in fact covered by the First Amendment. Therefore, any type of pornography that's actually filmed or written down or drawn is also therefore covered by the First Amendment. So I'm not necessarily in favor of making porn illegal. Now, when it comes down to protecting kids about watching pornography, one way we can actually do that is to make sure that the parents are actually responsible and actually have some sort of self-responsibility and make sure that they check about the website that the kids actually watch and block the websites that actually have porn. Another way to actually make sure that kids don't have porn in their hand is largely by having a website that says like www.xxx.com. That way, a parent can actually block all the websites that way. The noxious tenets of critical race theory and gender ideology should be excluded from criteria at every public school in the country. These theories poison our children who are being taught on one hand to affirm that the color of their skin fundamentally determines their identity and even their moral status, while on the other hand they are taught to deny the very creaturelessness that inherent in being human and consistent in accepting and the givingness of our nature as men or women. I'm not necessarily against the idea of critical race theory not being in schools whatsoever, largely because critical race theory teaches the ideas of intersectionality. It teaches the idea that colorblindness is actually a bad thing. It teaches the ideas of separate but equal. And so basically the whole set of ideas was actually done throughout the 70s and 80s. And so there's actually pedagogy in some schools. And so I'm not necessarily against public schools not having critical race theory. I would say in a college setting, however, like if a teacher want to teach critical race theory for students, I'm not necessarily against that. But the problem is that sometimes, students are not necessarily using critical thinking when it comes on these ideas. And so I think the best way to teach it in college is basically have it that the kids actually ask questions about it and challenge the ideas instead of just believing it. Allowing parents or physicians to read inside the sex of a minor is child abuse and must end. For public institutions to use taxpayer dollars to declare the superiority or inferiority of certain races, sexes, and religions is a violation of the Constitution and civil rights law. It cannot be tolerated by any government anywhere in the country. No disagreement here. I have zero disagreement whatsoever about this. Conservatives should gleefully celebrate the greatest pro-family win in a generation, overturning Roe v. Wade, a decision that for 5 decades made a mockery of our Constitution and fabricated the deaths of tens of millions of unborn children. But the Roe decision is just the beginning. Conservatives in the state should push as hard as possible to protect the unborn in every jurisdiction in America. In particular, the next conservative president should work with Congress to enact the most robust protections for the unborn that Congress will protect while deploying existing federal powers to protect innocent life. In short, they want to ban abortion nationwide. I'm not in favor of this whatsoever. I understand that millions and millions of women will be affected by this. And so I do understand that there actually are circumstances where abortion can actually be justified. And so to ban it outright makes no sort of sense whatsoever, largely because when a woman has the abortion ban, for example, they will still have it anyway, but underground. And by having it underground, it's actually going to make the whole entire situation much more dangerous as a direct result of that. And so they're going to still have abortion anyway, but it's going to be affecting their health and they'll possibly die as a direct result. Because women in the past basically had to use coat hangers to actually have abortion prior to it being legalized. And so we're going to go a step back by having an abortion ban nationwide if it were to be enacted in policy. TikTok and any other aim of Chinese propaganda and espionage should be outlawed. I'm not necessarily in favor of a TikTok ban whatsoever. If the concern is that the Chinese government is actually spying on people and getting their personal information, then they should actually regulate that. And so I'm not necessarily in favor of that in the slightest. Diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. The next conservative administration should dismantle the USA's DEI apparatus by eliminating the chief diversity officer position, along with the DEI advisors and commanders, cancel the DEI scorecard and dashboard, remove DEI requirements from contracts and grants tenders and awards, issue a directive to cease production of the DEI agenda. I'm not necessarily against that. International religious freedoms. Conservatives believe international religious freedom is central to the USA's developmental efforts. President Trump's executive order on advancing international religious freedom instructed the Secretary of State in correlation with the USA minister to budget at least $50 million a year for programs that advance international religious freedom and ensure that faith-based and religious entities, including eligible entities in foreign countries, are not discriminated against on the basis of religious identity or religious beliefs when competing for federal funding. I'm not necessarily in favor of using taxpayer money for faith programs internationally or locally. I think the best way to do that is to make sure that the citizens of a country use their own money and not necessarily taxpayer dollars. And by doing that, you're basically violating the Johnson Amendment. And so I'm not necessarily in favor of that kind of program in the slightest. Department of Education. Federal education policy should be limited, and ultimately the Department of Education should be eliminated. When the power is exercised, it should empower students and families, not government. In our pluralistic societies, families and students should be free to choose from the diverse set of school options and learning environments that best fit their needs. Our post-secondary institutions should also reflect such diversity, with rooms for not only traditional liberal arts colleges and research universities, but also faith-based institutions, career schools, military, academics, and lifelong learning programs. I'm not necessarily against that personally, largely because I have noticed since prior to the 1980s, when the Department of Education was actually established, that education for the United States was actually higher in comparison to when the Department of Education was actually there. And so perhaps maybe just maybe, having school choice is actually a better option than what we have right now for the case of education. Because unfortunately, right now, we're like one of the lowest rated countries in terms of education for first world countries in the current day. And so perhaps maybe this whole entire solution is actually going to be better if we do in fact eliminate the Department of Education. So, based upon what I just read, there are some things that I agree with, and there are some things that I don't necessarily agree with. For example, I do not agree of using taxpayer dollars to actually pay for fake programs, not in the slightest. I don't agree with the TikTok ban. I don't agree with the abortion ban across the whole entire country either. Now, some of the stuff that I did agree with in the documentation includes the elimination of the Department of Education. I also agreed with the fact that CRT should not be in schools whatsoever. That should be gone. I also agree that we should also not have diversity, equity, and inclusion in the government as well. And so if they were to, not go after abortion and not actually respect separation of church and state, there will be no objection against this documentation. But unfortunately, because there are some things that I did not necessarily think was actually pro-liberty, that's why I'm against the whole entire notion of Project 2025. But what do you guys think about this documentation? Tell me in the comment section down below. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video.
It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler. It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler. It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler.